Good evening and welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Queensland. My name is Greta Nabbs-Keller and I'm an Executive Council member of the AIIA in Queensland, and I'm also a Research Fellow on Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific at the University of Queensland Centre for Policy Futures. And tonight we're going to be talking about the prospects and pitfalls for the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, also called the Quad, and hearing a view from India in a special event with an eminent Indian guest. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue is a strategic grouping comprised of the United States, Australia, Japan and India, and a commitment of its member states has waxed and waned since its inception in 2007. We've recently seen the Quad expand its remit in the face of COVID-19 and pressing strategic challenges, and there's new added momentum to the Quad. The Quad, although, however, remains quite contentious, particularly among some key Southeast Asian states. Of course, China sees it largely as a US-led containment mechanism, and Russia, of course, is an interesting, a pivotal defence partner to India, also has some reservations. So we're going to talk about recent developments and aspects of the Quad with our special guest this evening. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, who's the Director General of the National Maritime Foundation based in New Delhi, India's foremost resource centre for the development and advocacy of strategies for the promotion and protection of India's maritime interests. As a maritime practitioner, his experience stems from a 4-decade-long distinguished career in the executive branch of the Indian Navy. This includes a stint in Antarctica and a 3-year deputation to the government of Mauritius, where he set up and commanded the Mauritius National Coast Guard, and 4 command appointments, including Principal Director of Naval Operations and command of the Indian Navy's sole aircraft carrier of that period, the Virat. As Rear Admiral, he was the Navy's first Assistant Chief of the Naval Staff, Foreign Cooperation and Intelligence, where he conceptualised and executed the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, also known as IONS. He's been Chief of Staff for the Western Naval Command and was in his last naval appointment before retirement, the Commandant of the Indian Naval Academy. Admiral Chauhan is on the visiting faculty of the higher command establishments of all 3 of India's defence services and tri-service establishments, such as the College of Defence Management, Hyderabad, and the National Defence College, New Delhi. He's been advising the Indian government through his interaction with the integrated headquarters of the Ministry of Defence, Navy, the Ministry of External Affairs, and the National Security Council Secretariat. And Vice Admiral has been commended 3 times by the President of India for sustained distinguished service. The Admiral is a prolific writer on maritime and strategic issues with over 95 published articles to his credit. So I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Admiral Chauhan here to discuss the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue this evening. And first, Admiral Chauhan, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the National Maritime Foundation and how it engages with the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue in research and policy terms. Thank you.
Well, certainly, and thank you very much, Greta. And let me thank the AIIA and the University of Queensland for the opportunity. That having been said, of course, I can now launch about 4 hours into the National Maritime Foundation. I'm aware, of course, that we have great time constraints, so I will try and speak as rapidly as I can, hoping that my Indian accent is at least vaguely comprehensible. So the National Maritime Foundation, or the NMF, as it's ubiquitously known, is, as you already said, India's foremost resource center for the development of and advocacy of strategies for the preservation, the promotion, and the protection of India's maritime interests and objectives. It is, Greta, a non-government, apolitical, and gender and age agnostic Track 1.5 organization. The foundation is manned by a small but efficient and productive group of researchers, of whom I'm inordinately proud. They comprise highly accomplished, albeit, as I said, young and dynamic civilian researchers whose academic and analytical skills are pretty strongly supported by a group of experienced practitioners drawn from the serving community of officers from the Indian Navy and the Indian Coast Guard principally. So the NMF is pretty unique in that it is the only think tank in all of India that focuses entirely upon the whole gamut of activities related to the maritime domain. And I want to show you very, very quickly one slide to demonstrate what I mean. So our approach, I presume you can see this slide better?
Not yet, Admiral, if you press share screen. Yes.
So let me quickly share the slide and then see whether we can't get it to run again. So second attempt.
We can see it now. Go ahead. Thank you.
All right, great. You know, you need to try again, Robert the Bruce. So the NMF's approach to the maritime domain is really that we look at the maritime domain in two broad segments, the blue economy and holistic maritime security. The blue economy is something that I want to emphasize. I have been trying and I continue to try to wrest the blue economy away from economists. So I want to say that, you know, if you concentrate unduly upon the word economy, then you miss out on blue. And the question is not how much, as far as the NMF is concerned, it's not how much an ocean economy can contribute to your national GDP, but how blue is your economy. And the second, of course, is holistic maritime security, about which I will speak in a minute. Both of these must rest upon a legal framework where national or municipal law is reconciled with duly ratified international law. So I'm going to stop there in terms of my share and go asking you and ask you once again to allow me to speak a couple of minutes more or a couple of seconds more on the organization that I'm so privileged to head. So this whole business, as I said, it seeks to dwell upon holistic maritime security. And by that, we mean, what is holistic maritime security? It's simply freedom from threats that might arise in the sea or through the sea or from the sea. And these could be freedom from man-made threats or hybrids or natural ones. And so once again, allow me to share one slide and show it to you. This is a typology of the threats that I've been talking about. And these threats could be, as I said, man-made. We're familiar with all this, traditional, non-traditional, but traditional is of particular relevance to the Quad. And the fact that the Quad is not concentrating upon non-traditional is one of its great weaknesses. So man-made threats, whether traditional or non-traditional, natural ones, combinations, climate change, ocean acidification, challenges in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, quite apart from the Dobie's list, which you're seeing on your screen already. So really, as the National Maritime Foundation, we concentrate, as I said, on this entire thing. And since the NMF is not a pure track one organization, to answer your question specifically, it does not and it cannot engage with the Quad directly. So instead, what we do is it does so by sort of providing carefully analyzed approach papers and policy relevant papers and recommendations to the government of India. And I think that I've got one last slide to show about the NMF, and I'm sorry to keep popping in and out of presentation mode, but I'm hoping that you will indeed forgive me and allow me to show you the next slide. So I hope that you can see the slide, Greta. So
yes, I can.
Yeah, good. So these are broad areas of maritime research interest. 5 of them, holistic maritime security, of which I've spoken. We concentrate both on thematic stuff and country-specific ones, technology of all kinds, the blue economy I've spoken about, ocean resources, which are intrinsic to the former, and public affairs, especially public international maritime law, in which we are all extremely weak. So that really is the remit of the National Maritime Foundation. And We try our very best to address all of this with a number of ministries of defense, of external affairs, with the National Security Council Secretariat, the Ministry of Earth Sciences, Petroleum and Natural Gas, New and Renewable Energy, and of course I could go on and on and on and on. But at the regional level, let me emphasize that what we do to shape policy is through the garnering of professional in and across the think tank and academic communities of the Indo-Pacific. And that is what we sort of consider to be our holy grail, which we chase after with great assiduity. So I'll stop there, take a breath, and hand it back to you.
Thanks, Admiral. I'm going to pick up on what you said there about the traditional threats, and you also acknowledged that the lack of the Quad's focus on non-traditional threats is one of its weaknesses. And we'll pick up on that a bit later, I think, around the close around the prospects for the Quad and how it could maximise its influence and indeed effectiveness. But I want to draw you back to the traditional threats and link that to Indian strategic and foreign policy perspective. I mean, many of our listeners will know today that, you know, strategic tensions between China and India have increased markedly. Of course, not only dealing with China's expanded reach into the Indian Ocean region, which has partly led to the rebadging of the Asia Pacific to the Indo-Pacific to take account of the geopolitical significance of the Indian subcontinents and China's reach, but also, of course, on the Himalayan border, Admiral. The world's been watching with bated breath as two major powers have indeed clashed with each other physically on that line of actual control. I mean, how do you see the Quads from an Indian strategic foreign policy perspective? What's its significance in the traditional realm of traditional security threats?
You know, Greta, I'm going to skate out onto some fairly thin ice, because the cardinal rule in having a dialogue with a renowned academician is you never end up crossing swords with her. And so I'm not going to do that, but I do want to emphasize a couple of small things. The difference between this term strategic as we use it and foreign policy, and what they mean as far as we are concerned in the NMF, and especially what I'm concerned, with specific focus, of course, remaining on the Quad. So given, once again, do you think I could just once again pop across to a slide and come back?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I am going to, you know, it's pretty hard for me to do this because I don't really know what the next question is. So I am struggling and I need some empathy on the subject. So here goes. Share this screen once again and try and hope that you will be able to see that in front of you. So can you see that screen?
Yes.
Okay. So given that our desired end state is our common desired end state is the economic, material, and societal well-being of the peoples of the Indo-Pacific, and not some disembodied nation states by themselves, I think that India's maritime policy is stated by the acronym SAGAR, which everybody here should be familiar with, and it's diagrammatically depicted on this screen. So what this represents really is that India's fundamental strategy in approaching the whole region is founded upon the approach of constructive engagement. To recognize that, leave aside China and the trans-Himalayan borders, China as a power that is rising with increasing aggressiveness, increasing recklessness, and I would dare say increasing brinkmanship, is not something that we will be able to or should be able to handle independently, nor is it necessary for us to absorb, to reduce everything to a confrontational binary of India and China. So I think that what I wanted to emphasize is available on this screen, and that is that, you know, it isn't that we have there's no such thing as a separate strategic. Strategic is an adjective, and it presupposes that you have a strategy. And so I think every country has a set of geo-economic goals and a set of non-geo-economic goals, and then it develops geo-strategies for the attainment of these geo-economic goals and separate strategies for the attainment of non-geo-economic goals. And then, of course, we have assurance and insurance mechanisms which answer two questions. What do I do if my strategy isn't going? What do I do to make sure it's going to work? And whoops, it's unraveling. So what can I do to buttress it? And that's the two assurance mechanisms and insurance mechanisms. And those are the two instruments of foreign policy, namely the diplomacy and the military. You'll notice I haven't included economy because economy is the goal and not the means. So let me sort of come back to what I was trying to say and not have everybody distracted by the screen. Really, you know, when we are trying to do this business, we're trying to find common approaches to common interests. What is our interest? Navies, unlike armies, are not structured and not created to handle threats alone. They are structured to promote interests. And when these navies interact with one another, they must find ways in which to do this business of the promotion of interests. Now, two of the critically important initiatives that enable the pursuit of these common interests, Greta, that is, they provide, in order to provide holistic security across the region and promote blue economy, again, on a regional basis. The foreign policy wonks in all countries are hopelessly out of date in that they are concentrating upon economic aspects of the blue economy and are seldom able to use the blue economy as a foreign policy tool. Which is the country that is an exception to this? Australia. Australia needs to take a deep bow and feel very pleased with itself because it's the only country in the Indo-Pacific that is overtly making use of the blue economy, drive for cleaner oceans and stuff like that, by transferring it from a pan-Australian narrative to a pan-regional one. So what are the two really important initiatives? The first is the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, or the IPOI. This was launched by the Prime Minister of India, but Australia was quicker than India to off the mark, as we have come to expect. And I think that many universities in Australia, the University of Queensland most certainly, are at the very forefront of this push. The second is, of course, the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And once again, let me remind all our viewers and all our listeners that Quadrilateral Security Dialogue doesn't equate to Quadrilateral Military Security Dialogue. It equates to Quadrilateral Holistic Security Dialogue. And so, if the Quad members and the bureaucrats and the officials, and even, I dare say, the political leaders, if they forget this, they do so at their very great peril. So if they get it wrong and they concentrate upon military security alone to the exclusion of other forms of security, I think that we're in very bad trouble, because security is much more than military security, and maritime is much more than the Navy Coast Guard amalgam. And so it's against this backdrop that we need to see the current and potential significance of the Quad and evaluate it. I have read some very good articles emanating from Australia, and I'm deeply respectful of those authors, and I'm also deeply in disagreement with them, because they once again have sought to narrow the perspective down to this business of hard security alone. So the very foundation on which all security, all interaction, all intercourse between nations across the maritime domain must rest, the foundation is a rules-based order. There have to be some rules so as to create order. Now the question is, what rules are you talking about? In the maritime domain, I think that the UNCLOS is an obvious one, but so too is SUA, so is the IMO, so are the many conventions that flow out of the International Maritime Organization. Then, what are the rules that we want to use? our common approach for all the countries except China is that we would like to have these rules consensually arrived at through debate, through discussion, through argument, through whatever, but not through coercion, not through bullying. Do not make the rules in any one country and simply say that, make out the game, make out the rules. That I think is fine for a board game, but it is not an apt approach to international relations. And
so I'll just pick you up, Admiral. I'll just pick you up on a couple of interesting things you've raised there. And you talked about, and we don't want to just see it as a Sino-Indian binary construct, as you said, but you talked about brinkmanship and aggression to some extent, and you talked about insurance and assurance. I mean, would it be true to say, Admiral, that the Quad has gained greater relevance for India in light of these perceived strategic threats? And when I say strategic, I mean the application of military force, strategic threats from China. Would it be true to say that is it your insurance policy? Is the Quad another insurance policy for India?
Of course. Of course. The Quad is both an insurance policy and an assurance policy. Remember that the Quad allows, if Quad navies are to be pushed into the forefront, as I indeed feel that they ought to be, if Australia's participation in Malabar is to become a regular feature, what does it do? What priority that we actually are according to this business of navies being involved in this manner? One, we're trying to build interoperability, of which we will perhaps have some other time to speak on. But I just wanted to emphasize that the other thing is that you're signaling. What are you signaling? And to whom? And are the signals you're generating the same as the signals that are being received? And I think that in this case, once the Quad is operating as a Quad, there are strong strategic signals being given to say that, hello, A, this is a signal of resolve. B, this is a signal of solidarity. That means none of us are acting alone. You cannot split us and talk to us or deal with us individually. C, this is a grouping which is not about navies. It's not about who's got how much money. It's about what are our intrinsic values. How are we looking at the world? And this is a much larger question than simply who brings what, shiny toy to the table. So that is the real, I think, value of the Quad, because we, as I mentioned, this strategic business. Let me address it squarely. What do we need to do? We need to be able to say that, all right, this is the strategic approach. Now that generates a certain number of objectives. How should we categorize these objectives? The 4 members of the Quad to begin with. And are the 4 members of the Quad, the Trinity plus 1? Or is it important for us to engage as the Quad, as a Quad, in dialogue with many other stakeholders of the region? And I rather think that the latter is true, or at least the latter is likely to give better results. So first, what we've already discussed, what are our common interests? We've discussed what kind of policy we might have, whether you call it Sagar or you call it anything else is irrelevant. And thereafter, we must be able to Quad must be able to break this down into objectives. How should we categorize these objectives? I think you should do it thematically. IUU fishing isn't going to worry about whether it's in the South China Sea, or it's in the East China Sea, or it's in the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, or off the Gulf of Aden. IUU is IUU. And secondly, thematic, so there are thematic approaches. Infrastructure is a thematic approach, but there are also country-specific approaches. So we need both these categorizations to be done. Who's going to do it? I think that this is the job of think tanks in conjunction with academia. And if we don't do it, and we haven't done it, it reflects stark failure on the part of think tanks and academia to actually become relevant to the policy maker, other than saying that, spend more money on so-and-so weapon system, or so-and-so sensor system, or so-and-so platform. This is a this is a duty that academia and the think tank community cannot afford to arrogate unto somebody else, nor abrogate from its own remit. I think that that's really, really quite important.
So it draws me back to a comment you made. You talked about the Quad navies at the forefront, and I acknowledge what you're saying about the think tanks and the policy relevance and responsibility to the policy community. And I want to pick up on the values in my last point about the Quad image problem and some perceived clash of values, particularly with key states like Indonesia, other key maritime states in the region. But on the Quad, in more practical terms, if Quad navies should be at the forefront, Admiral, and you talked about interoperability, in practical terms, what should the navies be doing? Should they be doing more combined exercises, staff exchanges, dialogues? You know, we've both worked in defence diplomacy. I mean, what in practical terms are the prospects for the Quad navies to collaborate more closely?
First of all, the short answer is all of the above. The real answer is that this fascination with the sexy end of things, you know, ships out at sea, you know, guns and missiles firing, torpedoes being launched, submarines, that's all critical. But the purpose of doing all that is to generate, as I said, interoperability. And yet, so many of us go home thinking that interoperability is only about technology and cryptography and, you know, okay, let me give you an example, Greta. If you take interoperability and we take it within a humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, HADR sort of paradigm, great, so you brought the blankets and I brought the blankets, who brought the tents? And that is interoperability too. And if my boat goes into the water and you know, the engine packs up, and that's the only way I can get to the jetty because, or the shore, because the wharves and the jetties and the you know, harbors and the ports are all going to be damaged, then can you hoist my boat? Can I hoist yours? Is this requiring us to have a overarching foundation and agreement? Isn't this part of interoperability? So can we do that on tabletops? Yes, we can. Should we do it on tabletops? Yes, we can. Can we do it in planning conferences? Yes, we can. What about medical facilities? Isn't there any? Look at the situation we're in right now. COVID and COVID vaccines are hot topics for discussion, and both of them there seems to be a marked lack of interoperability amongst them. So I think that all these are really, really quite important. You know, navies function along 5 basic action trajectories: dissuasive actions, deterrent actions, preventive actions, curative actions, and punitive actions. So it's not always necessary for us to concentrate upon the punitive. It's very frequently required for us to concentrate upon dissuasion. So what should navies be doing? What should the Quad navies be doing? They should be meeting like chums who meet every day. Not necessarily at the grand level, not involving 4-star and 3-star, but every day pick up the video phone and say something. Say that this is how we did it. Do you know, Greta, that the Indian Navy, of course, as you already mentioned, China has been in active deployment continuously on warfitting, that means combat deployment. We've also engaged in massive amounts of humanitarian assistance, both outbound as well as inbound. We've also done evacuation of our nationals from across the western segment of the Indo-Pacific. We have not had one single case of COVID. Do you not think that this is worth sharing? That how did you manage that? And what should we do with that when we're talking about the highest end of warfare, which is, say, biological warfare? Can we all learn from the Indian Navy? Is it necessary only to learn from X, Y, or Z? And if we do that and we create hierarchies within Quad, we are creating schisms that we cannot afford to create. You want to get the Quad to actually work vis-a-vis China? We have to be able to knit the region together so that there are no fissures through which China can make a strategic entry.
So are you suggesting, Admiral, then you know, I know from my experience in defence that often bilateral defence relationships alone are extensive and comprehensive often, I know from Australians' perspective with our regional partners, but I think what you're suggesting is that there's still a lot of room for increased coordination and communication among the Quad navies. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely, without a doubt. There is a very large amount. So I might be interoperable with you, but you are an alliance partner of somebody else, and the interoperability levels there aren't as high or are higher in certain areas. So as a grouping of Quad, what should we be doing? Will bilaterals multiply into 4? Or do we need to get all 4? And I rather think that we need to get all 4, and we don't. Once again, I mean, this is becoming a hobby horse of mine. I apologize, but what I'm saying is that we cannot afford to look at solely the high end of conflict. We must look at that, but that's not all we must look at. And because success breeds success, we must have as many points of success as a Quad, not as individual bilateral exchanges of navies or countries or militaries.
Right. I want to talk now about this kind of image problem that the Quad has in some quarters. And in the synopsis, we talked about ASEAN. And as an Indonesian specialist, I know Jakarta has some reservations about the Quad. And it does come back to the values dimension, doesn't it? In the sense that, Australia and India and the US and Japan, they sell the Quad as its basic foundation is around a free and open Indo-Pacific. But a strategically important state such as Indonesia sees the Quad as a sort of an exclusive mechanism, and a mechanism that may in fact inflame strategic rivalries further. And we also mentioned about the threat to ASEAN's centrality. Certainly Jakarta sees itself as a leader in the region, that the regional order should be mediated and moderated through that ASEAN as that center, the core of the multilateral architecture. How can the Quad deal with some of these challenges with such a strategically important state, but beyond Indonesia, other Southeast Asian states' doubts as well?
Well, I think that you've already touched upon one of the main thrust lines of my answer, and that is really to do with centrality. So who and in what area ought, first of all, I think that the Quad is a particularly badly named organization. I think it's really hard for me to understand why you would create a structure and then name it after a geometric shape, simply because you have automatically limited yourselves. So now you're only stuck with Quad plus, Quad plus, Quad plus, square root of, and so on and so forth. So apart from promoting mathematics, I rather think that we started this off extremely unimaginatively. Having said that, ought we not to be involving Indonesia? I think, to me, and Australia, but I cannot speak for Australia. I can certainly hope to try and speak for one perspective of India. India has 1.4 billion people, and therefore we have 1.4 billion perspectives. But let me offer you one of them. And that is that of all the countries to our east, perhaps the most important country to us is Indonesia. Indonesia sits astride every one of the choke points that connect the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. What Indonesia thinks, what it does, how central Indonesia wants to be is a given as far as I think we should be concerned. So Indonesia is suffering from its own set of challenges of capacity and of capability. But our effort ought to be to bring them in. So from the Indonesian perspective, is the Quad challenging ASEAN centrality? I think that it's quite the reverse. I think that the Quad countries are all four individually and collectively bending over backwards to reiterate, to re-emphasize that ASEAN centrality is the linchpin around which all these structures are revolving. However, when you talk about Russia, now you're talking about a different level of centrality problems, and I rather think I would like to engage you on this. Look, this is my perspective, okay? So I have no idea what South Bloc thinks or doesn't think, but I want to say that from my studies, or our studies, Russia is having a centrality problem which is internal to it. It is the centrality dispute between Moscow and Vladivostok. So is Caucasian Russia to stand as it has stood for centuries as the Russia, and the others will only be the Russias? Or is Moscow about ready to recognize the centrality of Vladivostok? And ironically, the closer Russia gets to China, the closer it gets to China, the more its economy feeds into the Chinese economy vis-a-vis energy, and in particular natural gas, and to a limited extent crude oil, the more central Vladivostok will become.
Admiral, I'll just interrupt you there for a moment because I'd like to call for questions, and we have one question which I'll turn to shortly. But I thought on Russia, for the benefit of our listeners who don't appreciate the defence partnership, the close defence partnership between New Delhi and Moscow, and indeed I guess if not the dominance, the large numbers of Russian military platforms in use by the Indian armed forces. Can you just explain a little bit about the significance of that relationship and why we're even talking about Russia in an Indo-Pacific context?
Yeah, well, first of all, you should be talking about Russia in the Indo-Pacific context, even if it's only to figure out whether it's a spoiler or not. Secondly, the engagement of India with Russia is a time-tested and extremely valuable one across to India. There are simply assets that the Russia-Indian relationship is able to generate which cannot be generated by anybody else. Well, not because they don't have technologies, but because they don't have those kind of difficulties. So the S-400, for example, is a very good illustrator of this. The Americans simply don't have this because they never needed it. You know, they're not going to go to conflict with Canada anytime soon. And so there are areas of cutting edge technology which the Indo-Russian partnership has allowed to develop. And we would be extremely loath to simply surrender all that at the altar of a new partnership. We don't think that these partnerships are in conflict with each other at all. There are some constituencies which believe this to be so, but we're not amongst those. And so the way to handle that, I think, is simply through innumerable dialogues, some of which are like this. So how important are Russian platforms to the Indian military? Derek, the support that the Russians have given us for subsurface capability in the maritime domain or aircraft carrier, we're shifting across, the diversifying, but yet there are many assets that, as I said, it's not a question of some other country sulking. It's just a question that you don't have this. And we need it because we are facing existential threats. Unlike any of the other members of the Quad, we share an actual physical border with China in which people are dying. So our approach is quite similar to the difference between, say, the United Kingdom's approach to the Indo-Pacific and the United Kingdom's approach as it was to Northern Ireland.
Right, I'll just interject. Oh, sorry, Admiral, I'll just interject there because I'm mindful of the time and there are people that are keen to engage with you through some questions. And I know you're at the existential threat there comment, which is of interest. But let me just go to one of the questions from Hayley Channer. She's a former AIIA intern and now works for the Perth US Asia Centre. So her question pertains to prioritising and organising Quad cooperation. And she says, since the Quad Leaders Summit, there are now 10 Quad working groups These range from COVID vaccines to climate change to countering disinformation to supply chains. What 2 or 3 areas does the Admiral think the Quad has the most, and I think she's got a typo there, I think she means convergence, has the most convergence on?
I think the most convergent area in the most immediate term is obviously going to be COVID and how we're going to handle COVID. But if you look at COVID as an influenza-based epidemic, 100 years, we've seen a number of them. We've also seen that after a couple of 3 years of or 2 years after the recession of the epidemic, global economies pretty much bounced back to where they were. So what are then the real approaches or the real slightly longer term approaches of convergence between Quad members that are to be prioritized? I think number one is the certification of infrastructure, of regional connectivity, of maritime connectivity, of people to people connectivity. And since the Indo-Pacific is predominantly, even if in deference to Russia, not exclusively a maritime expanse, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, there is going to be some centrality which has to be afforded to the maritime domain. Port-led development. I think this is critical as we address everything from East Africa down to the western shores of America. Port connectivity, the issues of connectivity are going to be critical, and they are areas in which we don't have large disagreements.
We're having questions come in thick and fast, and so I noticed you outline, I know the Quad recently, the inaugural summit meeting committed to 1 billion vaccine doses. So I'll move on to the next question. This is by our AIIA Queensland President, Paul Lucas. And he's asked, if I understand correctly, does India perceive that the other 3 members can have an arrangement that is better with, say, 75% agreement on issues rather than unanimity? So I think what Paul's saying is does there need to be unanimity in the Quad, or about 75% agreement, is that good enough?
Well, I'll go out on a limb and here and say that no, I don't think so. If you've only got 4 people, it's going to be difficult to carry one party that's sulking. And, it's different points in time, different nations have been known to. So I think that it is better with 4 people to have unanimity or consensus. If you have a larger number as Quad expands, then this cannot be the same model. Then in that case, I think you will end up with some percentage. But don't forget, nations aren't consistent over time in their responses to any structure and any other participant within that.
Right, I'll move on. There's another question. Are there any obstacles hindering the growth of the Quad?
Yes, the first of that is this inability of the Quad members themselves to transcend China. And that is, I think, the largest problem. And if we stop saying that this, even if we don't believe, if we can concentrate the Quad upon knitting the region together by ensuring prosperity, as a spin-off of that, you will automatically handle China. But if you worry all the time about China, you probably will not handle all the rest of the really important.
And indeed, that goes to some of the concerns with ASEAN members that it's all about China. And as you said, if you address some of the infrastructure connectivity issues, people-to-people links, that will remediate some of the bigger challenges for Quad members. There's a very good question here in relation to Indian political bipartisanship on the Quad. And the question is, there's a comment and a question. A nation's foreign policy can be a consensus in response to a nation's perceived interests, but it can also be a contested reflection of the worldview of the group in power. The question is, India's participation in the Quad, is it largely bipartisan, or may the pendulum swing back to a more traditional Indian position of non-alignment?
It's very hard to to answer simply because nations aren't consistent, as I've already said, in their different political dispensations, and all nations oscillate wildly within the realms of what each of the dispensations in defines as their country's interests. But the problem at the moment, I think, is that there is a large confusion in the of everybody between threat and interest, and which one should you concentrate upon. So the countries that are faced with neighborhood challenges, where you have fewer neighbors and more hoods, then in your neighborhood, then you will end up in concentrating upon threats, and this will be detrimental to you. If you concentrated upon advocating and evangelizing interests, I think that it would automatically lead to bipartisan support. But every political party that contends with every other has to have some unique space. If all of them agree, then there is the voter is confused. So consequently, you must not confuse political rhetoric with political actual action. A country may have internal comments about this, that, or the other, but it's important to see what do they do. So in India's case, whether it was one dispensation or it was the other, I think that you will see that there is a reasonable understanding of where we need to go. And there is definitely bipartisan support that India, look, there is bipartisan support for this one statement. Either India in the next 100 years or so will be a maritime power, or we will not be a power at all. That is a given. Now, what manifestations that should take, that might vary.
So what you're saying there, Admiral, is the future of Indian power rests fundamentally in the maritime domain. Right, I've just lost you a little bit there, sorry.
Sorry, I just said that unequivocally so.
Right. Okay, I'm just going to move on to another question there. I think you've answered some of this already, but actually there's two questions. One is, what areas can the Quad countries cooperate on to strengthen the Quad as a collective security grouping? And you talked about the collective strength. And the other question, if I may add that too, is what Australia and India can do together to counter the growing cyber attacks that encompass the entire domain of space and maritime trading operations. They make the comment, Maddie, these threats are originating daily from China and targeted towards Quad members, besides threats faced by many South China Sea countries. So what can the Quad do to strengthen as a collective security grouping and to counter growing security and cyber attacks? Thank you, Admiral.
I already said what I thought was one of the areas that I didn't talk about and which deserves some consideration is this whole business of public international maritime law and the use of lawfare. And we are being defeated. China is playing mind games with us all. And because we don't have strong, interactive approaches to lawfare. So I think that this business of lawfare and the utilization and the infirmity of international maritime law, which China is using to great effect, is an area that I think that Quad should concentrate upon. The connectivity of all kinds has already been mentioned. One of those connectivities is, of course, digital. And once you talk about digital connectivity, then disruptions of digital connectivity are automatically going to come in, and that brings you to cyber. So cyber disruptive activities, malevolent, is a subject that should really be taking center space, because as the questioner has correctly pointed out, this applies across different domains. So space, subsea, surface, port-led, military, non-military. If you are going to have smart ports, we don't want a Maersk incident once again. If you are going to have smart ports, you need to have strong cyber. This means the Quad countries must start to talk about common standards, not just in cyber, but most certainly in cyber. So standardization, the achievement of common standards, whether they are for the assessment of infrastructure and whether that infrastructure is real world infrastructure or virtual world infrastructure, is crucial. It's an area that needs a very much larger amount of effort than we are currently seeing.
And it was my idea or perception, if I'm not mistaken, that with the expanded remit of the Quadrilateral into supply chains and cybersecurity, there was a greater push towards common standards. Is that around cybersecurity infrastructure? Is that your understanding?
Yes, it is. But look at the promise that was held out by the Blue Dot Network. Then look at the amount of dissemination of what on earth is the Blue Dot Network across industry. And you will see that there's a large gap, and we need to, I mean, it offers us virgin fields in which all 4 countries can use their respective, efforts to plow. And so, yes, there are efforts being made, and no, the efforts are nowhere near enough. But is it good to say that there are efforts? Yeah. Is it fashionable to denigrate embryonic efforts? I think so. But is it useful? I don't. So I think that we identified these areas, and I think that the Quad is in fact proceeding towards infrastructure certification. We now need to find some way of financing this.
So on that note, this is really my question before I go back to a question from our president, Paul Lucas, but on the infrastructure certification, I mean, how do you see this in the context of China's Belt Road Initiative? I mean, is this a rival initiative? Is this an absolutely necessary initiative for Quad members to take in terms of enhancing infrastructure and connectivity across the region to provide alternatives to China's Belt and Road Initiative?
Would you go to a shop which sells one shirt? I am not asking, and I'm not advocating that the Quad should put out infrastructure development plans that counter the BRI. I am only suggesting that the regions, countries, constituent countries should have choices. And then they, in their sovereign power, and the exercise of that power, can choose whichever one they want. Right now, there's another comment, and I would like to make because it bears directly upon this. Any government can direct its people or its apparatus to build a port in a specific place. That anybody can do. No government can tell trade, come to the place I've made. Trade will come where there's money to be made. Money is made where there is efficiency to be obtained. How many areas have you yourself seen where efficiency matrices are drawn up with a forced decision matrix has been drawn up with weighted factors telling a government where to build a port? So we've got, do you think that the problem of Hambantota is because of the Chinese? Hambantota's inability to proceed is because Colombo is succeeding. And as Colombo expands, Hambantota will not be able to move. Should we not guide our friends, whether in India or in Malaysia or in Australia for that matter, on similar grounds?
Just for the benefit of our listeners, Admiral, could you just briefly describe Hambantota? I mean, for those who don't understand the Sri Lankan port and what happened there, could you briefly explain just before I move on to another question?
Okay, so Hambantota was is a standard dream of a well-intentioned, say, politician X. Politician X has a really good intent, and his intent is to improve the lot of his local people. His local people live in one of the poorer areas of a given country, in this case, Sri Lanka. So he has a view, and he looks at the American model of the Great Depression. And he says, well, how did they make it? How did they get out of it? The government opened mega projects. You know, they built bridges, roads. So let us look at building a mega harbor, which is really close to the international shipping lanes that run south of Sri Lanka. But trade is not determined by any given one factor. So when you are building this port, will your dream come true? Yeah, it will. Will your people get jobs? Yeah, they will. Will there be secondary jobs? Yes, there will. Secondary, tertiary. There'll be there's a requirement for gardeners, for washerwomen, for barbers. All that will happen. Then one day you will cut the ribbon of that port. And now you want trade to come. But trade is going to come, as I said, where there's efficiency, not just because you happen to be X number of miles or kilometers away from the international east, west, or north, south, or whatever trading lane. So the shipping lanes do pass in the immediate proximity of the south coast of Sri Lanka. Shipping lanes that come across from the west to east or east to west, this is a fact. The day that Colombo reaches capacity and cannot expand anymore, Hambantota will start to develop, provided you chose to understand, what are you building? Are you building a port that is a destination port for your hinterland? Or are you building a port which is a transshipment port? What are you building? And so a port is not a port, is a port. This has to be decided beforehand. And consequently, these matrices of which I spoke are really quite important. It is an extremely valuable thing. One of the questions you asked is what Australia and India can do together. That is really quite important. If we could sink our collective teeth into creating port matrices, I think that we would find that we have lasting, meaningful, win-win, beneficial, not just for Australia and India, but for the region. And that will handle China automatically. Right now, ports being built which are economically unviable.
Yes, and we know Hambantota is often held up as an example of death trap diplomacy. And for those who aren't familiar with it, you could perhaps look it up. We've got a very good question, because you talked here about choke points and we're talking about sea lines of communication and things like that. This question again by Mahadevan Madi: given China's economic prowess in growing their naval assets, should Australia and India focus more on A2AD, anti-access area denial strategies, to focus their key naval assets in key choke points of ANI, that's Andaman Nicobar Islands, and Cocos Island bases at the key choke point of Malacca and other straits between the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean region? So A2AD strategies to focus their naval assets.
The fancy American term, which actually has confused more people than it has clarified issues for, because it's really talking about China's attempt to create sea control in its first island chain area. If you want to create sea control, it means that I want to use the area for my purposes and I don't want you to interfere with it. Now, we had a perfectly good term, but Madison Avenue is Madison Avenue. And so we get a new term, which as I said, it sounds great, but it doesn't mean anything much more than what it was earlier. Having said that, should the Australian and the Indian navies be concentrating on choke points and deployment of capabilities, assets, capacities? Yes. Which ones? Ombai Weta. That's the one.
Can you explain, Admiral, what do you mean by Ombai Weta? I know, but for the purposes of our listeners.
Okay. So Ombai Weta is all these straits or the choke points are named after the start point island and the end point island. So you have Ombai at one end, which is an island, and Weta is part of an island, and Weta is an island on its own. Now, what is the relevance of this? This is the only strait through which submerged nuclear submarines of any country can transit between the Indian and the Pacific Ocean in either direction while remaining, as I said, submerged. If you didn't want a submarine to remain submerged, you ought not to have bought a submarine. But now that you've done that, this is the only way that you can do it. Once submarines which are nuclear powered enter a large space, then it's like looking for a needle in a pin factory. So in the Cold War, God gave the NATO the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. In our context, God has provided us with, first of all, its most blessed, I think, land, which is Indonesia, and secondly, Ombai Weta. Now, Australia is bang slap next door. Australia is also very, very well accomplished in developing undersea technologies. India is not so far behind. We don't tom-tom our stuff so much, but together with the rest of the members of the Quad, I think that yes, we should be doing so. So should there be a lot more Indian and Australian interaction in Lombok or off Lombok? Yep. So Lombok and Makassar should be part and parcel of our regular operating areas. I think to that extent, yes, I agree.
Right, thank you, Admiral. We're out of time now, and I'm sure our listeners would agree. There are so many fascinating tangents of this conversation, from strategic choke points, sea lines of communication, India's relations with Russia and Southeast Asia, and indeed a call for enhanced collaboration there between India and Australia as Quad members, and lots of practical recommendations for cooperation. I'd like to thank you very sincerely, our special guest, Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan from the National Maritime Foundation, New Delhi. It's been a great pleasure, Admiral, in talking to you, and I wish we could have much longer, and I look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you very much. I have one last parting sort of shot that I'd like to leave.
Please.
And, we haven't spoken about industry and the relevance of private-public partnerships in developing all these. I think that that's an area that needs considerable amount of investigation because it has huge potential. So industry cannot afford to be left out of these supposedly strategic discussions.
Yes, absolutely. And you conveyed it requires a holistic approach beyond traditional military cooperation. So thank you again, Admiral Chauhan, and good evening to you. I think it's afternoon in New Delhi, and thank you to all our listeners and attendees today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.